This Hangout on Air is live. Okay, so we're going. This is the Node.js API working group meeting on Friday, October 23rd. And so let's get going here. In the agenda, a couple of simple things. We'll start with some introductions for everybody to just say who they are and briefly what they do. I'll go ahead and start. I'm Patrick Mueller. I work at NodeSource. I do a lot of Node stuff. API stuff is of interest to me, and so I thought I would go ahead and contribute a little bit by organizing this call. So that's me. Who else wants to go?
I'll go next. I'm Stefan Padano. I'm a developer for IBM. I work with Michael Dawson here, and I'm new to Node, but I have an interest in this work group, and I'm offering my services, and I want to see what I can do to help get this off the ground.
Great, thanks.
And I'm Michael Dawson. I also work at IBM. We both work in the team that is pushing forward IBM's efforts on the Node front, and so the API side is something that's important and interesting to us. And that's why we want to be here to contribute.
Great, thanks.
I can go next. I'm Alexis Campaila. I work on Node.js Core on behalf of Microsoft. I'm interested in the API working group from a couple of angles, try to simplify ease the pain of building native modules, and also trying to figure out how other engines can coexist with V8, specifically Node Chapter.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, I will go next. My name is Oguz Bastemur. It's, in other words, you can call it Oz. I work on the JX Core source or JX Core project, which is kind of a little bit differentiated version of Node.js. And I'm interested with this API work group because what we are trying to do is very dependent on this API stuff, API work, that hopefully we are going to do. That's all.
Hey, I'm Jeremiah Sankfield, aka Fishrock123, and I'm part of the Node.js TSC, and I work on Node Core.
Great, thanks. What else we got? McCrousey and Trevor?
This is Trevor. We're a NodeSource core maintainer. I'm more interested in the JavaScript side than the native side, but I've been interested in this a long time, since it kicked back way off when we were still having a discussion with Joyent, died down, and then I wanted to resurrect it because, well, my main purpose for this is to gain performance in many different areas by removing a lot of the abstraction that Node has placed upon the native calls.
Cool. Who we got left?
I'm Stephen Belanger from AppNeta. I'm mostly interested in this from the tracing, debugging sort of perspective, just making APIs simpler and more sane to hook into and monitor and all that.
Great.
Okay,
One more.
I'm probably the last one in, am I?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, hi, so I'm Anton. I'm so interested really in this from the same perspective as Oz is there in JX Core. So I'm writing an API for growing packaged apps. It's pretty complete. and had a lot of. It took a long time doing it because there was no testing framework, there was no standard sort of libraries to pull in the same way as we do with LevelDB, and saw this crop up and thought it'd be a chance to contribute my findings and see what's going on.
Great. Okay. I think we got everybody. So I'm really new to this. I just kind of watched it from afar a little ways back, and don't know a whole lot. So I'm not going to be like driving any major discussions or anything. But in looking at just what's out there right now, and since I've been involved in a couple other work groups, I wanted to bring up a couple meta issues, and I have those up on the up on my screen now. Go ahead and present that to everybody. This is just the Google Doc that's pointed to in the chat, group chat. So the meta issues are, first of all, I guess there's some kind of a status that work groups have in terms of being chartered or not. This is something I just found out about yesterday, and I don't really know what's involved. So I was curious if anybody knows if this working group has already been chartered, or if the idea is this is a kind of proposed. Okay, it hasn't. Great.
Yeah, this all started out very informally, and I mean, initially we weren't even going to have meetings, but here we are having meetings with a fair number of participants. So, and maybe we can do that.
Okay.
So
yes.
we don't need to be chartered. Chartering basically is just like when a working group reaches a certain point, they can like basically have authority over a certain point from the TSC, but I don't think we need that yet. So.
Well, and I think our area of authority would be a little too broad, honestly.
Okay, that's all good news. And I was going to say, even if we wanted, become chartered, it certainly seems like something that would be kind of a low priority anyway, and I could start to look into it. But let's just move away from that. The other thing I was wondering, the name on the repo is kind of weird because it ends up being node.js/API, so makes you kind of think, oh well, this must be the Node.js APIs like from userland, right? FS and HTTP and whatnot. But it's clearly something a bit different from that, and or more involved. So I'm wondering if we wanted to actually change that repo name to kind of reflect that it's more of a working group kind of a thing than something that is just API. And with that in my, so I mean, does that okay, or I mean, what do people think about that?
I do see how the current name could cause confusion. I don't know if something like integration API or
maybe what we can do is this third question that I put in. So I put all these Q's in. Maybe we can kind of answer that first. The existing information that's out there is some documentation that talks about like high-level and low-level APIs, but I don't get a sense for what the actual purpose of this work is, and so I'm kind of having a problem in terms of the context. Is like how do I jump in? Why is this interesting?
I can explain that.
Great.
Okay, so on the JavaScript side, one issue that we're facing is more and more JavaScript features are coming in, and people want things to work in specific ways related to their interests, using async await or promises or whatever, right? And so they're telling us, hey, your API needs to return this thing. And unfortunately, we can't. It's impossible to support every JavaScript API out there. And so the purpose of the JavaScript API is to remove as much abstraction as is logical, because I already attempted the whole libUV.js thing, and it just doesn't work, honestly. There needs to be a small amount of abstraction for it to be usable. But to remove as much as possible and use the fastest methods that V8 gives us to achieve that, so that anybody who wants to attach their own API or interface into nodes internals from the JavaScript side can do that. One other purpose of this is to make it easier to test thoroughly. We have companies like Oracle and others who want to make their own engines underneath, right? They don't even use V8. And so they want a clean cut between the native and the JavaScript side, and then a clean test suite that they can run to validate that their implementation is correct. Now, that's impossible to do right now because there's a lot of if factors and things that just aren't tested, like certain types of type coercion and things like that. With a stricter lower level API, that's much easier to test and validate.
Yeah, may I add the side of native modules that Node.js exposes an API to native module author that also exposes the V8 and the libUV APIs, and so it's subject to the changes that in the V8 API, and even with an abstraction layer like NaN, the API is constantly changing, so it requires rebuilding modules at deployment time, which is arguably a very bad deployment story. So that's another problem that I think we should try to solve.
Okay, that's good. I realize actually the README on the repo actually does provide a little bit of context, but I guess when things that I'm familiar with kind of in this area are more talking about the lower level API and how we how you might be able to imagine being able to run existing Node.js JavaScript stuff on some other JavaScript engine. And typically, I've seen those things in the past called like SPIs as opposed to APIs, and I'm not even sure what that stands for. I don't know.
I think service provider interface is often what that is.
Yeah, that's probably a more modern term. And so I wasn't really clear how this fit in with the actual APIs that we know and love and know today, from FS or NET or HTTP. But I guess we're talking about kind of all that stuff. So those APIs, as well as provider kind of APIs, as well as ABI sort of issues. And if that's all true, that's good, because that gives me a lot more context. That is pretty broad, but I guess what that means is we'll have some nice chunky kind of separate pieces of work that we can kind of all fold under this one umbrella.
Right. Now, in my impression was that we were going to tackle two of those three. So it wouldn't necessarily cover the external APIs and changes to those, but it was more focused on the two other layers. The one that if you're implementing an API or a service in Node, the internal set of APIs that you could use for that, and then at the lower layer, the sort of glue between the V8 engine that's seen both by Node and by the module.
Okay, so it would be, how to put this, if we were to create an abstracted API, right? I would expect every feature of the abstracted API to work on any platform that uses it, right?
Yeah.
Problem is, some features that we use in V8 are not available. For example, hooking into the garbage collector's prologue and resurrecting the object just before it's garbage collected, right? I'm pretty sure that like SpiderMonkey can't do that. I think IE might have just barely implemented that because of their IoT push and getting Node to work on those. But anyway, it's not available everywhere it's needed. So sort of following libv's example, where if a feature isn't available on a supported platform, then it's simply not implemented, then like we can't get 100% compatibility with the internal API usage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess you're saying there'll be cases where some platforms just won't be able to support some parts of the API.
Yes.
And I guess then it's for people who use, it's where those APIs get used, the decision has to be made, is that okay or not, right?
Well, okay, so as far as I understood what you were saying, you were talking about abstraction layer between V8 and like the JavaScript side?
Yeah, so I was thinking both at the node level and at the module level. Is it that you're thinking that on the module level, on the node level, that's going to cause problems where we won't have the features that are needed?
Okay. Just want to verify one more time. So the actual code that we write that interfaces node internal JavaScript to node internal native, that is the abstraction layer that you're talking about, not the abstraction layer that exposes API to a module author.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking two different ones. One which is the one you just said, and then the one which is, both Node talking to V8. Now maybe it's because you think some of these are the same, but like Node uses some V8 features, a layer there, and as well as V8 features and functions are exposed to modules today. So if you wrap both of those, you would end up having the separation from the actual JavaScript.
Yeah, so in previous discussions on threads, I don't remember where, we could probably abstract the current Node API for module authors, because that doesn't depend on many V8 internals, right? But as far as the layer that we use between like the Node internal libs and the V8 API, it just won't work across all platforms.
Right, okay. Some gap.
So Trevor, those features that don't work across all platforms, I mean, is it possible to have an alternative implementation or to isolate the features that depend on it so that we can say, okay, maybe this feature is not available on this platform, but at least you can get the bulk of Node running?
Well, okay, so in some cases, for example, the garbage collector and resurrecting an object, that is used by the VM module. If you don't have that ability, you cannot use the VM module.
Would an alternative implementation be feasible, or is just the whole semantics would be broken?
That I don't know. I've only briefly looked at it, and the way it's implemented makes sense, but I haven't done an exploration of alternatives.
Right. I think there's also two aspects to that layer. One is that, even if you continue to use V8, if you extract that layer, you can get to the point where when you go to the next level of V8, you don't have a change. You don't have to change your modules or necessarily Node to keep up with that. So there's still a benefit looking at it from that perspective. And then once you have the API defined, those specific issues that that you're calling out, I think will stand out more. And it's like, okay, well, you could implement it on something like SpiderMonkey, except you're missing X, Y, and Z. And so it's still a good first step to have that layer in place from the isolation of changes type perspective, and then it's a good step towards being able to look at, well, how hard is it to do those other things, and what's the impact of, like you said, okay, yeah, we could clearly document it. You don't implement this, well, VM isn't going to work, right?
Mm-hmm. So, as long as we all understand, from the current discussion, implementing a new lower-level JavaScript API, and my plan with that was that it would be possible to implement the entire existing node lib API on top of that, right?
Mm.
And so basically, Node, as it stands now, the lib folder would just be rewritten to sit on top of this new low-level JavaScript API. and then abstracting, if we were to abstract V8 itself from even the low-level JavaScript API, then we essentially wouldn't be Node anymore. We could fork this off, call another project entirely. Like literally, this would not be Node anymore, right? Just because then Node essentially is the lib folder in the current repository. That's what Node itself is brought to.
You're saying because it's not today, you include V8 as like part of Node as soon as you take.
We're completely changing the module interface. We're completely abstracting away V8 altogether. We're completely changing the JavaScript interface so that Node, as it stands today, the JavaScript interface can sit on top of that. Like we're talking about so much abstraction that it is literally no longer Node, right? It is its own thing completely. We could do all of this work outside and get it running, and Node wouldn't even have to be involved.
Let's do it.
How much work do you think it will take, Trevor?
Okay, so abstraction of the module API, it is going to be a fair amount of work, right? Especially because there are so many opinions of how it should be done. Honestly, I think the bike shedding that will be involved in doing that will be the majority of work. The abstraction of V8 and the JavaScript API itself is going to be tremendous. You might as well start from scratch, define the lower level API, and build it directly on top of the abstracted API.
Okay, so you're suggesting starting from scratch, basically.
That's essentially what we're doing, right? That is like, and then what we do after we create the abstractions is we write code to hook V8 into it, and we rewrite the lib folder to sit on top of the JavaScript API, and we're done. Like that's essentially what we're talking about doing.
Well, what about also considering the JX Core approach? They have an approach that works today, maybe not with Node v4, but with Node v10, I think, 0.10. And they've proven that it works. They can support a SpiderMonkey, and I think they're working on Chakra as well.
Yeah, actually recently, right now, we have V8 3.28, V8 3.14, Chakra, actually it uses 3.28, and Mozilla Firefox, SpiderMonkey sharing the same interface, same code base, by using different proxies. The only tricky part we are having, it's really tricky, the types. The native types. They are really tricky to handle. Sometimes, actually, we could have some sort of shimming approach, but because of the types and how routing is different among the engines, it's really tricky part. That's why we depend on macros a lot. I don't know if it's a good starting point or not. Probably it's open source. You can see and we can discuss all that. But I'm also open. I'm also totally agree with the other approach that hey, we can do it from scratch. That's also fine.
Maybe the two approaches are not completely exclusive in the sense that a smaller core would be easier to implement even like with built-in switches for multiple engines and maintain a single code base.
Actually, after proxying 3 different engines, my own opinion is I don't think it's possible to have something for very long-term kind of ABI stable. I don't know if it's possible, but we can have API stable. I think it's a better goal to have because there are lots of native modules around, and on each new Node.js release, some people are expecting to module developers to update to latest Node.js API or V8 API. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes there are some stability issues because of the changes, and That's the crazy part. For example, if we don't write it or update it by our own, using SpiderMonkey engine, almost none of the native modules are right now working on JX Core. Only if the user picks V8 3.14 release, okay, they are working with JX Core. But other than that, they are totally out of option.
So you're saying that you can achieve API compatibility but not ABI, is that correct?
I don't think we can force for ABI compatibility, considering all the changes, all the differences among them, and a couple of features, upcoming features to JavaScript. I don't know if it's something we can say, hey, it is going to be ABI. It is going to have stable ABI. It's not going to break, and no matter what. I don't know. It feels like, okay, it's a big, very big.
It can be guaranteed to be stable forever, but if you have a consistent API between different engines, then you should be able to achieve also a consistent ABI, right?
No, I don't think so. API from API, what I say, for example, in some cases, let's say we depend on NAN or JX Core using macros, let's say, or some inline functions, but consider we may change a little bit or heavily change them. What they are doing because of the engine updates, so it will break the memory structure of the API, and it's going to break the API eventually.
In the worst case, you could encapsulate the native engine types, right? You wouldn't expose those to the modules. Of course, otherwise, you wouldn't provide a consistent API. But if you were to encapsulate those with your own abstraction, maybe at the cost of some performance.
Performance is, yeah.
I think it's pretty clear for me that you couldn't. We don't have a stable ABI for Node on V8 because V8 changes so much. So the only way to really have a stable ABI is if we create one. And then that thing could be stable, and then would have to have sort of an adapter layer to V8, to SpiderMonkey, to whatever.
But you can't be indefinitely unbreaking.
Well, no, that's, I think, beyond go. I mean, things will break at some point.
Yeah. So then, I mean, a timeline. How long do you want your ABI to be unbreaking? Right.
How long has the Java ABI been non-breaking? Michael Dawson, you probably know that. How stable is that? As a goal.
I think through all the current releases, you can run over code. I think 9 may be one where that may not hold, but up till now, I think it's always held. Yeah,
I mean that was one of the kind of rare things I liked about Java is I could build a native DLL. And I wouldn't have to compile it, release to release. It just worked, right? So that's not an easy thing to do.
I was going to say
another approach. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say at this point, I don't think we're even at the point where you get API compatibility necessarily. I guess the key difference between API and ABI is in one case you don't have to recompile. The other case you may have to recompile, but at least you don't have to change your code, right?
Right.
Yeah, and that's what NAN tries to achieve, right? Like API, not ABI, but just API compatibility. And they did pretty well right up until V8 decided to introduce the maybe locals, which just destroyed everything. But no, they 8 to 12 months, they were able to maintain API compatibility, which from our track record is really good.
Well, if we could piggyback on that track record and say achieve the same API compatibility would be a great step forward already. Another approach worth considering is that of not exposing so much of the engine internals as much as we do now, but use a foreign function interface, which I believe for the great majority of native modules that are not there to extend Node's functionality in the sense of exposing additional Node internal functionality. It could be sufficient. This is the approach that .NET uses, and it would be much easier to implement, reduce that dependency, basically. What do you guys think about FFI as a native module interface?
Yeah, I've used FFI in a couple different languages over the years, and
like from JavaScript?
Not from JavaScript, other languages, and so for instance, like back in the Smalltalk days, we had an internal API that similar to the V8 internal API, or that a module author would use. We also had FFI, and it turns out nobody ever used the internal API because the FFI was just so much easier to use, right? You didn't have to write any C code at all. So I think that's actually a great idea, but that's not kind of the way Node module authors kind of think, and we don't have an FFI in core yet. But I honestly do think that is a pretty good idea.
So just a note, FFI in Node.js is almost certainly going to end up being too slow for NodeBots usage, where they're running stuff on much slower machines.
I think you're referring to Node FFI, which is an implementation that's out there. That's very slow, but somebody from Node Chakra looked at this issue and kind of prototyped an FFI solution, and their findings was that it doesn't have to be much slower at all. And that
No, in JavaScript, you mean a JavaScript exposed FFI?
Yes.
No, I was in that thread. His last comment is, "There's no way this can happen. No matter what you do, it's an order of magnitude slower."
I was under the impression that the conclusion was different.
No, like the type coercions and object munching you have to do under the hood is so crazy expensive, comparatively, and it's not even the cost of the FFI or even the JavaScript. It's the cost, like maybe another inching could do it faster, but V8 at least being able to do all those conversions into the interface on the native side from JavaScript is just too slow. I mean, literally, it's so slow that I'm writing code to speed up Node and actually pushes stuff back up to JavaScript from native to like do object munching and then bring it back down, because doing a single object operation is so slow.
Right, but you wouldn't be marshalling complex objects. You would just be marshalling basic types, like int and dates, things like that. It would be a different approach, maybe.
FFI typically has FFIs typically have kind of fairly rich structuring capabilities that the current Node FFI does. They actually have a separate thing called resources or something. It lets you essentially build structs and deal with pointers and structs and etc. So it can get rich. To Trevor's note, I'm sure the perf is bad. I totally trust you in that space. However, I did some timing a while back on it, and yeah, it is slow. However, if you look at where, like in the past, where I've used FFI, it was for things like database invocations and stuff like that, where the time, because we're not talking about it's taking like hundreds or even tens of milliseconds to make these calls. It's a couple milliseconds. So if you look at that in the context of these like humongously long running things, that particular time doesn't make a difference. Now I understand that it certainly does. Like you wouldn't want to build a FS on top of it, FS module, but it might be appropriate for some folks to do it. I'm not sure. Is somebody already handling FFI? Should we do FFI in Node, or is that another thing that we should kind of?
There's been a discussion.
It's sort of stalled out.
There's been a discussion on that in a PR actually, and we the implementation in the PR was kind of scattered, and we said if FFI is implemented, it has to be localized to just the FFI module because of the amount of exploits that are available through that. I mean, using that, I could actually write a string to memory and then execute it from JavaScript.
Yes, it's dangerous. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, we basically decided for any enterprise customers to make it simpler. It's like, okay, you just delete the FFI module on startup so nobody has access to it, and then you know you're safe again. Because exposing that in JavaScript just gives you crazy access to do stuff. Like, we weren't opposed to it. We just wanted it to be contained.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I understand.
And then, like, nobody followed up on the PR, so it died off.
Was somebody else going to make a comment? I think there were a couple people jumping on.
So the other thing about FFI is it can't be our only option, because as I mentioned, there's people who use this stuff on machines that are much lower power, that even if your machine can do it relatively fast for what you're doing it for, some of these robotics types applications simply can't do that on the platforms they're run on.
Yeah,
It can't be our only option.
Yeah, no argument. I don't think anybody would argue with that.
Right, and there are modules like Node Inspector, right? They're meant to expose V8 functionality, so we still want an API for those things.
Hey, that's actually, thank you for bringing that up in a tangential way. Right now, we expose a lot of stuff to get information from Node about the process itself. And if we allow this abstraction, we just have to yank out all of that.
Well, some of those functionalities would always be engine specific, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then that's specifically what we're talking about.
It doesn't prevent us from doing an abstraction layer for other things.
Yeah.
You know, I think what I'm hearing there, and this is something dear to my heart, is a debugging API, you know, essentially. And that might be another thing that we want to look at. And that might end up being sort of a bridge for some of these kind of diagnostic APIs that we have in Node userland today that probably don't belong there, because they're more like introspective, debugging, diagnostic kind of things, and not application building things. So I think if we actually had something like that that was useful, it would probably make sense to yank some of those existing APIs out.
Well, unfortunately, depending on where you stand, we very well might be bringing in V8 Inspector. There will be pulling it out of the Chromium project and making it a self-maintained module, so that we can actually bring that in, and then that way we can just send out all of the debugging information to using a standard API. Now, if that's brought in, there's already a ton of tooling around that because it lives in Chrome, but also all of their JavaScript files are also standalone, so you can embed it into anything else you want. But I don't know, just throwing that out there, like, I doubt other implementers would want to implement that as well. So yeah, even any of the debugging stuff would have to be removed from the extraction.
I think we need like two separate buckets. That one is like, this is our promise to API, that like we can just stick this folder of stuff on top of your lower level thing and it'll work. And then another stuff that's just like implementation specific stuff, because like we already have that like V8 file that, like you said, has a bunch of stuff in it that is V8 specific, and like all of this extra debugging stuff. And there's always going to be platform specific things that we will have that just won't work in other VMs.
All right. I want to get back to we're 40 minutes in, and this was planned for an hour. I wanted to see if we wanted to go through any of the other things that were listed in the agenda. So let me paste that again. And I can't remember who this is from. I know somebody here actually put some of this stuff in. But if we want to use this as some talking points for the rest of the meeting, maybe I haven't really looked through here.
Yeah, I think it was kind of a number of points of, what some of the discussion that's already taken place, but also some of the things that you would start to delve into to try and narrow down what specific things we want to do and what some specific next steps might be.
And also there is one point, I don't know if it's written here or not. For example, let's say the latest V8 engine has some features and none of the other engines sharing the same features. Let's say this is on the JavaScript land or native land. If Node.js, for some reason, would like to introduce that feature, what we are going to do with the API side? Because that's the breaking change. Even for API.
Right there, you bring up a really good point. I mean, there's plenty of language-specific features that we can't control. You'd have to go back in time to a specific version of the engine so that all of them support the same feature set, right? V8 can now support maps and sets and stuff like that. SpiderMonkey supports freaking everything. It's a developer's playground. I remember working at Mozilla. There were features implemented that weren't even a spec yet.
Yeah. For example, proxy.
Yeah, and shared array buffer. I remember when that first got in. I had no freaking idea what it was. So, I mean, right there, you're once you do that, you'll almost have to just write a document or something that says, "Okay, if you want to be cross-platform capable, you cannot use all of ES6."
Well, hopefully, if the delta between the engines is not too huge, some compile time switching could be feasible. Like to enable some newer features under if-def.
Well, I have never seen any compile time flags for V8 that allow you to disable maps and weak
No, I'm
maps.
saying in Node, if we wanted to take advantage of those features, we could say if engine V8, then do this and use the feature. If not, revert to a different behavior that works with other engines. So.
Okay, so in V8, and this has been proven many times, the only anything behind a flag will break. We've had a large number of reports of people trying Harmony, whatever, and then their process aborts or crashes or whatever, right? Nobody in the TSC would ever advocate for enabling those because they will crash in some scenario. V8 only makes,
I think that it may be slightly different, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I think it's like a runtime flag that says, if you're on this engine, I'm going to do something. If I'm on a different engine, I'll do something else, as opposed to being on or off. And then, if we are trying to support multiple engines, we'd want our CI to run the test suite on all of those engines.
But what about modules that use features of one engine that aren't available on another?
Right, so that's the next layer. I mean, the first layer of the problem is making Node properly support the engines. The next layer is, okay, you've got the same problem in the modules. And like you said, I mean, I think at that level, it's kind of a documentation thing where, if you want your module to run across, you're either going to have to do the same kind of thing where you're aware and can see which engine you're on and choose to use a feature or not, or you, I guess, code to the lowest common denominator and don't use certain features.
Yeah, I mean, as long as everybody understands and is cool with that, then I have no problem with that. I just wanted to make sure that was
Yeah, I don't think we can do much better than that, right?
cool.
Yeah.
No, for example, I was talking about strong mode, which is recently introduced, right? I don't know if it's anything similar to strong mode in other ranges. This is kind of, it's not any ES-related update.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, strong mode. Okay,
that's Google,
let's implement that. Yes, strong mode. Let's implement that on SpiderMonkey. I don't know. For example, I mean, what we are doing or what we are going to do is kind of very related. What needs to be introduced into Node.js core, right? Because let's say today strong mode, yeah, the other day extra mode, and hey, we decided to introduce extra mode. Okay, API fails. Our API thing, everything fails because there is no extra mode, or there is no such a thing extra mode. It's just something good for V8 or something they want to do for some reason.
Right. I think that's what Alexis was getting at. You know, you either don't use them or you have some way at runtime to say I'm going to use it if I'm on the right engine.
Yes, or even a compile time.
Yeah, you're saying compile time of the module or of Node itself?
Oh, no, well, I think step one is if we're able to provide an engine that, and a new node that can work with multiple engines, but it's actually different builds. That's step one, right? Step two is be able to load the engine at runtime, which is a bit more complicated. So I think if you can achieve step one, that's already a good achievement.
Yeah, we're certainly going to have to look for small steps that we can try and tackle because the whole problem is so large.
Yeah, what I was thinking, well, one of the other reasons why I wanted to hit the JavaScript API first is because I felt like if all of right now Node has some APIs that go directly into native, but if everything can be a JavaScript call first, then anybody can write something underneath to accept those calls and basically pass the test. And I figured the easiest barrier to entry would at least say, okay, we can run all JavaScript modules on whatever. Because as like almost the entire discussion thus far has been about native modules, right? And I feel like that is going to be a much tougher nut to crack. So anyway, that's why I am starting there, is because I feel like that's an easier thing to gain in the short term.
Yes, I think your approach would help even if we follow other approaches as well. I mean, if you reduce the surface of the engine versus the rest of the node internals, that can only help, right?
Yeah, because in the worst case scenario, right? If you didn't want to, say you're working out abstraction and you're finding it has performance issues or whatever, or also, I mean, there are many modules out there today that either are or use other native modules. And the likelihood of them switching to a new abstracted API is low. It would more depend on new modules being written to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
on that note, I should point out that I'm working on a module build service that would build native modules on demand. So that's kind of a short-term strategy to ease the pain of deploying native modules.
I like that.
Yeah, it would work in the short term, and then, for the long term, we can have a better API for them. Get rid of the problem in the first place.
All right. Well, we have 8 minutes left, so I think it's time to start winding down a little bit. Finish up with some of our trailing bits. So, kind of the main things are when we want to meet again, and so we can have people start thinking about whether we want to have a regular meeting and how often. But let's kind of concentrate on do we want to have another meeting in a month or 2 weeks or something like that. And the other thing is sort of coming up with a list of action items based on what we know. And I see somebody has already put in, or maybe they were already there, actionable items. And I don't know if you saw me before, I was kind of trolling around the existing issues as well, just to see what we had out there. So I think we probably have some work to do in terms of figuring out what the chunky bits here are. There's kind of what Trevor said he was wanting to work on, and that's some very interesting work. And then there's other things that have been discussed that maybe other people can kind of spend a little bit of time on, think about, and write some notes up on. So I think we should try to. We've got a few minutes here. Try to settle on maybe a couple of those. So let's do the meeting first. Do we want to meet again in like 2 weeks or a month? Are people interested in doing that? Are the meetings done? I'm sorry.
I'd say yes. It's a good way to review, if we've made progress or not.
Right. So maybe not every 2 weeks, but once a month would be my preference.
Yeah,
personally, I don't have a lot of cycles to spend on this.
Yeah. Once a month is kind of my default take on how often to do things like this. Looking out, we have some U.S. holidays. The Thanksgiving is coming up in about a month, and then of course December is kind of a dead month. A lot of people off, so we probably have time to maybe fit in a meeting somewhere there, either before Thanksgiving or very early December. So I will start to put a doodle together for that next meeting, just for some dates that won't affect too many people. And then about the action items. So probably the best way to do this is to either create some new issues, if there don't exist any already, to cover the kind of chunky bits that we're thinking about. And there's already a couple that look kind of interesting here, like the initial JavaScript API definitions, abstracting data types. This is a good one as well, use cases for node.js API. Are there any other specific issues we should be open based on what we were talking about today?
I would like to not kill the FFI approach yet. So maybe we can follow up on GitHub to prove or disprove that it's a viable approach.
The FFI?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds fair. Let's kind of raise that as an issue. What about FFI? And gather some information on it.
Trevor said very interesting thing actually, which is, hey, if we are going to do this, we are going to do something totally separate, and it's not going to be Node or actual Node itself. I don't know if it's very early to say, but do you think it's possible to make a work or call it like Node 5.0, Node 6.0 or something? So this work group has a mission to accomplish, right? Instead of, okay, we are going to do something in unseeable future. But instead of that, can we see or can we define the thing? Okay, this can be Node 5.0 because this is a breaking change. Whatever working for Node 4.0 to long-term release, it's not going to work with this one. And this will be the actually real long-term release, because after this point, any module, any application switching to this version of Node will be compatible to future versions of Node, right?
It might be a good idea to just come up with a completely different name. That's not that great of a name. As Trevor mentioned, this isn't Node. This is really, it's kind of a Node compatible thing, or that's the intention, but it's not really the Node that we've been using all these years.
Well, I don't think we want to be telling people it's something completely different. People use and like Node, and are we going to be then saying switch to something else?
Well, the other thing I was going to add is, it's way too early to be suggesting anything like that, right? But, I mean, just as a kind of like thinking far ahead, what could possibly happen, it'd be more like a Python 2 versus Python 3 switch or something. I mean, a difference, right? The language probably not going to, well, the language will change by then, but, it's that sort of a sea change in terms of the differences.
Exposed API shouldn't be that much different, though, should it? Like, what we're actually exposing as Node on top of that will basically be, like, pretty similar to Node as it is today, so I don't really see what the big deal is.
Well, right. The JavaScript, but the native API will, everything will have to be rewritten on the native side.
Yes.
Well, unless NAN can do as good a job to the new API as it can to the changing V8 API as a bridge.
Yeah, as a starting point, would it be possible for anybody coming from other backgrounds to look at NAN and be like, okay, we could shim this, we could shim our stuff into NAN.
Right.
Right, and if NAN has to make some adjustments, sure, let's try and make those adjustments. I think that'd be a feasible starting point. Saying that we're going to replace all the internals, I'm not even saying I'm opposed to that. I'm saying that at right now, at the stage we're at, is just too big of a task that would take a year or two at minimum to conceive.
It's definitely an effort.
That will be a breaking change for NAN, right? Because NAN doesn't do anything with the types. That will be a breaking change for the NAN also.
Should we create a repo for prototyping so that any experimentation we do can be in a single place?
Well, we got one.
We have a repo under this working group.
Oh, this one, okay.
Yeah.
So,
if we
does it fork the node source code?
No. This was just going to be when I created it, it was just going to be a docs repo with everything that, all the discussions and issues and whatever.
Yeah, and that's fine. In terms of a place for prototyping, maybe what we can do is just work this a little organically, and so if people actually end up having some amount of code for some reason that they'd like to put stuff in, we could look at trying to fit it in here. Maybe reorganize this into a docs directory. And if anything becomes, a thing in and of itself, then it works out. I kind of hate to start just creating new repos all over the place, without really having a history behind it that we need to do that, because oftentimes they kind of peter out.
Yeah, but Alexis,
yes.
It's not called. It's not Chakra anymore. What's it called now?
Chakra, not Chakra.
Yeah, it's for Edge, right? What's the V8 engine for Edge?
Chakra. Yes.
Sorry. It's still Chakra. I thought they were replaced completely. Okay. Anyway, the team for the IoT devices actually wrote a crazy impressive compatibility shim for V8 to get it working, which I was honestly really impressed by. And I would love to hear feedback from them and get get some information back from them about how it was, how it went. I mean, one thing is I was in a thread of the new WASM spec that's being written, and I was talking about how not all browsers have garbage collection detection or object detection where you can notify, and one of the Microsoft dudes jumped in and said, actually, we support that now because we had to write those shims for Node. So I know that they did a large amount of work to get that working, and I'd love their feedback.
No, it would be great to get them in this working group, and actually I have a meeting with them on this minute. I'm on Redmond campus, so the plan is for them to participate. They just have some resource shuffling, but I'm going to try to pull them in as much as possible.
Yeah, that'd be great, Ed. Maybe we can even sort of plan on having them talk to us for half hour or whatever it takes, maybe even the next meeting, just as kind of background information for us.
Yes, definitely. We'll get them in the next meeting.
Okay, well, we've managed to use over an hour, I think, 5:03 anyway. And I got to go. It's 5 o'clock on Friday, so I have things to do and drink.
Yep, gotta run too, guys.
Was there any last minute things before we sign off? All right. So we'll get the meeting minutes out, get the YouTube movie published, and start thinking about next meeting and looking at filling in some more information about what's going on here over the next month. So talk to everybody next month, probably.
Talk to you guys
Thanks,
later.
everyone.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks. See you later, folks.